The reality is that the majority of people who attend the concert, the 1 million spectators, will be from the UK, and they will spend money which originated in the UK from their own wages. Those people would spend that money anyway on either going out for a meal, drink, weekend break, holiday, clothing, or something else. And we call this dead weight. So from the perspective of the UK, most of the expenditure which takes place is dead weight. What will happen is that in those locations which are lucky enough to be hosting Taylor Swift concert, there will be a redistribution effect as people from across the country come to the various venues and spend their money in their host locations. So the host locations will benefit to an extent, but it will be a redistribution of money that would have been spent elsewhere anyway.
Right, so maybe some people will spend some money they wouldn't otherwise have spent, and that will create some temporary work, and maybe some people will come to the UK from nearby countries and bring their spending with them, and that's a real gain to the UK economy. But a lot of the spending is what Simon calls dead weight. It's simply redirected. You're going for a pizza in Edinburgh instead of going for a pizza in London. And that doesn't alter the total spending on or the production of pizza in the UK economy as a whole. On the other hand, Edinburgh will benefit. So do we have any estimate of the boost to a local economy when Taylor's in town?
Yes, we did speak to someone who has done some analysis on this in US cities. Natalia Lechmanova from MasterCard compared the spending in US concert cities to an alternative reality of what you would expect to see if the concert never happened.
What we found is that restaurant spending increased by 68% relative to this control within 2.5 mile or 4 kilometer radius of the venue around the days of her concert. And similarly, hotel spending was up 47% in the same area and 32% within a wider 10 mile, which is a 16 kilometer radius of the venue.
Right, so that's local economies, but what about nationally? Simon Shibley seemed to say that the local increase of spending is just money already in the UK economy that would have been spent elsewhere.
Yes, and that's not all. While money from Swifties will go into local business, we shouldn't forget the biggest business that benefits, Taylor Swift Inc.
From the perspective of the UK, most of the money which is spent will end up being expatriated to America, which is where Taylor Swift and her business is based. So it might be rather unedifying to make the point that what we're looking at here is actually a very significant invisible import effect, where money originating in the UK ends up in America.
So some of your money will actually be leaving the UK economy, not boosting the UK economy.
Correct.
And do you have your monster costume already?
I'm not a monster, I'm a monster on the hill, Tim. And yes, it's almost there. I just need to redistribute some money to get some final bits.
Enjoy.
Thanks.
Thanks, Billy.
Sometimes I feel like everybody is a sexy baby, and I'm a monster on the hill.
You're listening to More or Less. The prison service in England and Wales is feeling the squeeze. It's coming perilously close to capacity. Unusual steps are being taken to ease the pressure. Reports are that the police are being asked to pause non-priority arrests and some large-scale operations. Operation Early Dawn releases some suspects on bail and delays their trial, and the government has also extended a scheme releasing some low-level offenders up to 70 days early. Basically, the prison service is struggling to cope with the number of people in the system. An increasing prison population is new. It grew sharply from the mid-1990s until the early 2010s and was roughly stable until 2020. But after a dip at the start of the pandemic, it then increased sharply and has recently reached record highs. I spoke to Cassia Rowland, a criminal justice specialist and senior researcher at the Institute for Government.
If we look to just before the start of the pandemic, so February 2020, the total prison population is up about 5%. So it's not the same kind of magnitude that we saw in the kind of 90s and early part of the 2000s, but it is still significant given how high a starting point we were at in 2020.
Yeah, and if your mug of coffee is full and you add 5% more coffee, then you're going to have coffee on the floor.
Exactly.
So how close are we?
So we currently, as of the 17th of May, had just over 1,000 prison spaces available.
How high is the total prison population?
The total is about 88,000, so it's a really fine margin.
Yeah, roughly 1%. You described this growth in the prison population, but is that just because of population growth or something else?
So I think probably it's not population growth. So on the whole, crime levels have been falling over that time. You can look at the number of convictions. So those as a whole have fallen, and they've particularly fallen for more serious offences over the time period we're looking at. So indictable offences, which are any offences that can go to the Crown Court, have fallen 40% from 2013 to 2023. So we don't think it's about a change in crime patterns or population.
Let's start with sentencing then. What role does sentencing policy play in the prison population?
So increasing sentences is clearly a big part of the picture. That average custodial sentence went from just over a year in 2002 to 20.4 months last year. So that's a more than 60% increase. And we know that for particular offence types, the increase is even bigger. So that's particularly true of sexual offences. There have also been changes to how much of a sentence a prisoner serves in prison. So rather than being released halfway through their sentence, so they spend half of their sentence in prison and half of it on licence, that's now gone up to 2/3 for certain violent or sexual offences. And if we look at how the makeup of people in prison has changed over time, that increasing length of sentences is really what was driving that initial period of growth from the 90s through to kind of 2012, thereabouts.
Right, but so implicitly then that doesn't explain what's happened more recently.
Right, exactly. So what's driving the rise in the prison population now is the increase in the number of people on remand and the number of people who've been recalled to prison for breaching their probation conditions or further offences. Prison recalls are up 140% since 2013. It's a really dramatic change, and that's a massive factor behind the current capacity crisis that we're in.
And what about remand?
So remand is also up. People on remand now make up nearly 20% of the total prison population.
That seems, sorry to interrupt, but the idea that 20% of the entire prison population is prisoners on remand seems astonishing.
Yes, it's pretty extraordinary. What's interesting about this is the remand rate hasn't really changed at all since 2013. So the proportion of people who are defendants or who are awaiting sentencing who get remanded in prison has held pretty flat. The difference is that people are serving longer on remand. So this is really driven by the backlogs in the courts. And that's why the number of people on remand is up 64% since 2020.
What's happened to the capacity of the prison system over the last 10 years or so?
So prison capacity hasn't increased that much over the last 10 to 15 years. So since March 2013, it's grown about 2%.
How is it that we managed to not build enough prisons? How did we get here?
The first thing to say is this isn't a new problem. This is something that we've seen coming for years. So the Ministry of Justice does projections of the prison population, and that has consistently shown that we don't have enough prison capacity. They've really struggled. So there was the Prison Estate Transformation Programme from 2016 to 2019 that aimed to build 10,000 new places, and it managed 206.
Our thanks to Cassia Rowan from the Institute for Government. You're listening to More or Less. And you could be listening to More or Less this Saturday morning when our weekly extra podcast episode comes out. This one's about another election, the one in India, and what the data tells us about the world's most populous democracy. That's all we have time for this week, but we'll keep crunching the election numbers and hopefully have a bit of fun into the bargain. Do send your questions, comments, or campaign leaflets claiming that only the Liberal Democrats can win here to mororless@bbc.co.uk. We will be back next week. Until then, goodbye.
More or Less was presented by Tim Harford. The producer was Charlotte MacDonald.
Nature Table finds the funny in flora and fauna. Giant squid, by the very name, get very, very big. They've got the basic squid body plan. That sounded like a sort of exercise regime.
Imagine the basic squid body plan.
Join me, Sue Perkins, for a show and tell of the natural world's fascinating artefacts.
The moon is speeding up slightly, and it's actually moving away from us something like 4 centimetres a year. Don't go!
So I've brought some examples here of wasp brilliance. Just think of them like a bee, but if you shaved them a bit.